Okay, all right. Well, hello everyone. It's the final. Let me just get the lighting so you guys can see me better. Okay, there we go. I think that'll work. All right, it's the final video on which I review the Daughter of Fortune story. I'll focus in on the final four chapters, chapters 18 through 21. And since there's a lot of information, a lot of themes, a lot of topics, a lot of stuff floating around, I'm going to reserve the majority of this video to talking about uh, virtually everything and anything, and of course to give my opinions, my perspective, my analysis about those chapters. And I'll just say a couple quick things and not get into a lot of detail about what's happening in the Rawls and Bean chapters, in chapters 13 and 14. The chapters, of course, which corresponded with the Daughter of Fortune readings. So I'll just say a couple quick things about that. But like I said, the majority of this video I'll focus in on the Daughter Fortune story itself, that is everything happening in chapters 18 through 21. And and of course, since this is the history of the California class, it seems kind of fitting that I go with the California base team for today. So I'm definitely happy that my Ducks are doing pretty well, still in the top in the Pacific division. So hopefully they'll bounce back over their heartbreaking loss to the Kings last year and make a pretty good run to maybe get their second Stanley Cup. All right, well, let's go ahead and get on with it. Let's talk about the events happening in chapters 18 through 21. And of course, with me, as always, is my little iPad mini here. So let me get my password in and get my notes together. And, and and these are the chapters. These are the chapters corresponding to. This is the information corresponding to the chapters named "Disillusion," "Sing Song Girls," Joaquin, and "An Unusual Pair." So to pick up the story with chapter 18, and of course this is the second part, the second half of part three of the story, because as we've seen so far, Allende has been splitting up the story into three large parts. And part three, which I talked quite a bit about last week, covers from the years 1850 to 1851. So it's the fall. It's the late summer, early fall of 1851, September of that year, when California had become a state. And interestingly, Allende starts off. One of the things she starts off with the chapter is stating that she calls a progressive disillusionment had set in, and people were beginning to return to their old habits, because it looked like, even though there was a sense of euphoria and excitement in the fact that California was now a state, there was a feeling of, I guess, realization that the hangover, the quick wealth, the riches, that all the excitement of 1849 had begun to wear off by the middle part of 1850, and obviously for a very good reason. When you have limited resources in terms of the best gold deposits being already taken out, and massive influx of people, obviously there's going to be problems, there's going to be chaos, there's going to be fighting, and and one thing that happens as more and more people come in, of course, more and more Eastern interests come into the scene. And Allende points out that powerful companies have taken over the mining operations from individual miners. So early on, whereas the first couple of years of the gold rush were more of a sense of a way in which an individual could achieve fame and fortune without having to worry about any boss man or mayordomo or patron looking over him, or a state or government or a king. Hey, that's my land. You peons, you peasants, get out of there. That's my land. That belongs to the king. Blah blah blah. That mentality didn't really exist, say, in 1840, 1849, but in 1850, now with Eastern interests coming onto the scene, you might say, for lack of a better term, multinational or multinational corporations back in those days. Those began to come into scene, as I mentioned in one of the previous videos. That's where you get this idea of a hydraulic mining operation, which of course Rawls and Bean cover quite extensively in the California text. So let me take my glasses off first so I can see my iPad better. One of the interesting things happening in chapter 18 is the fact that Jacob Todd had of course resurfaced as Jacob Fremont, and Jacob Fremont is now writing all kinds of stories. He's, you might say, one of the early muckrakers, a topic I cover quite a bit in the History 109 class. But he's writing all kinds of stories about the uh, uh, what's happening, and of course he starts writing stories about this bandit Joaquin roaming the countrysides, avenging injustice against the Mexican people. I'll get into a little bit more about that when I talk about chapter 19. But it seems that Dao, for his part, he begins to get disillusioned with the greed and materialism of the people. But despite that, he is quite attracted to the area. It looks like he wants to make his home in California. Interesting note about Asian migrants at the time and into the early parts of the 20th century. For the most part, the migrants going in, Asian migrants going to the U.S., especially from China, were essentially known as birds of passage. What that meant was that they wanted to go to California, that is make enough money, and then go back to their homes to start families, find wives, that type of thing. That was the ideology for many Chinese men. But as it became harder, more apparent that uh, it would be difficult for them to go back to China, they settled in reluctantly in California, and of course establishing large Chinatown communities in places like, of course, San Francisco, Sacramento, and also in Los Angeles. But of course, as we've seen in both the Rawls and Bean text and in Daughter Fortune, a lot of those communities were, of course, targeted by these vigilante groups, which I'll get into a little bit more about in chapter 19, actually. Um, Meanwhile, Paulina is really starting to establish herself in San Francisco. Um, um, she sets up residence in an elegant Victorian home, and she declares that the family will be aristocracy, the new aristocracy in California. Also in this chapter, another interesting family secret from the Summers is revealed. This, of course, is the fact that Rose had been writing anonymous, lurid stories about fantasy. Much like what, say, Jackie Collins and Daniel Steele used to do back in the 70s and 80s with their famous Harlequin romance novels. And of course, I guess you could throw in the 50 Shades of Grey stuff as part of the equation. Long before all of that, it looked like Rose was a pioneer in that type of field. And John, for his part, was cashing in on his sister's success, establishing an account in her name. All right. Meanwhile, while John is in a saloon with meeting with Jacob, he noticed that one of the girls in the saloon has a brooch. This is a brooch that, of course, belonged to Eliza. It was not an Asuna Placidas who we met earlier in the story. It turns out she is there, and once John realizes that the brooch belongs to Eliza, it's then when John begins to put two and two together that Eliza is alive. She's somewhere in San Francisco, or in Northern California, and asked Jacob to help out and try to find his niece. Okay, let me see what else you mentioned about chapter 18. Life for Eliza and the rest of the traveling caravan, the body show troop, I guess, if you will, with Babalu, Joe, Tom No Tribe, Esther, and all the other people. They were suffering through some illnesses, but the people of the community pulled together. So even though you had this motley collection of a group of people, they were able to find common cause with a lot of their neighbors, even though their neighbors may appear to be these more devout, religious. I wouldn't say puritanical, but more. I guess what's the word I'm looking for? Spiritual, I guess, is for lack of a better term. People, for the most part, they're able to find common cause. It didn't matter what everybody's background was. Everybody was working together, and that's one thing that Eliza, of course, Joe and Baba Lou had definitely encountered. So it seemed that for Eliza and for people like Joe and Baba Lou, it wasn't so much material wealth that they had found, but the sense of family, the sense of community, this sense of village life, I guess if you could call it that. That's what they were clearly finding toward the end of chapter 18. All right. Okay, moving on to chapter 19, the Sing Song Girls chapter. There's chaos in the streets of San Francisco in the summer of 1851. Crime and corruption were everywhere, and this is no big surprise because when you have a case when you have a state that's only 1 year old, but don't have enough political institutions to really mature and deal with the large influx of people, you're going to have a lot of problems. It was the opposite case back in places like New England and Virginia, in which you had the institutions first, and then you could deal with the more and more influx of people coming to the area. California was the exact opposite. You had too many people first, lack of institutions. So of course, it's definitely bedlam, chaos, shenanigans, wild and wacky stuff. You name it, the list goes on, and not surprisingly, vigilante committees and these infamous hounds were on the loose. A lot of whether they were American or also Australians. Australians were also pretty nasty guys too. There was an infamous band called the Sydney Ducks from Sydney, who were also causing mischief and mayhem in the streets of San Francisco. The one who's writing about all this stuff is Jacob in his newspaper accounts, and Jacob also writes about the infamous case of Josefa of Downeyville. Josefa was a Mexican woman who was accused of killing an American miner, but it was for self-defense. Uh, this is a story that's elaborate, of course, in the Rolls and Bean text, but to make a long story short, because Josefa had the gall, the temerity to kill an American man, there was a kangaroo court, trumped up charges, all of that, and Josefa was, of course, executed. She was hanged in 1851, thereby underscoring the idea that there was no sense of justice, state institutions were clearly not mature, and racism was all over the place with Mexicans, Native Americans, and Asians, especially Chinese, being ready targets for these vigilante groups. Okay, let me see what else I should mention here about chapter 19. One of the things that happens in chapter 19 is, of course, that Dao finds out about the practices of the infamous Madame Toy. Toy runs a prostitution ring, these brothels, and what's happening to the girls, that is, they're being used up like Kleenex, for lack of a better term. Once the girls outlive their usefulness, they're left out to die, and it's up to Dao's job to, in essence, facilitate the process. So Dao is finding out a lot of the dirty secrets, a lot of the things that goes on with among his people with respect to the treatment of women and young women and young girls. Okay, all right, and Dao is so incensed by what's happening, he seeks Eliza's help, and Eliza turns to members of the community, where she turns to Esther and James the blacksmith, the Quaker, who actually ends up marrying Esther. Of course, Esther being one of the girls with Joe and Babalu and the rest of the group. Okay, Chapter 20 is the Joaquin chapter, and it's the winter of 1852. And what's happening now is that Californians are now starting to, you might say, get integrated with the rest of the world. Of course, railroads will be coming on the scene much later, and I'll get to a little bit more about when I say a few things about the Rolls and Bean text. But in terms of shipping goods and shipping commodities, of course, this is stuff that Paulina had talked about much earlier in the story. You might say, the impact of what she had been striving for in terms of what she does or other rival companies. That's coming into the scene in that we're seeing the shipment of all kinds of goods coming into California, such as fresh fruits. Paulina knew early on that shipping goods was the key to success in California, and as it turned out, she would be proven right because Feliciano, her husband, his mining operations are being decimated by the violence directed against the workers. It seemed that Feliciano and his brother tried to replicate what was happening in Chile by having a company and having their own mining operations and employing these workers, undoubtedly Mexican, Chilean, maybe Native American. But the fact that these were foreigners, this was galling to the American miners, the Anglo miners. Something had to be done to them, and not surprisingly, Feliciano's operations were pretty much decimated by the vigilante justice taking shape at that point in time. Okay. Oh, among the things happening here, of course, that's mentioned in the book, but in more detail in the Rawls and Beatix was, of course, laws like the infamous foreign miners tax, which was mainly targeted to try to push away a lot of the influence of the Mexicans in the area. But the foreign miners tax ended up costing the state a whole lot of money, and it turned out to be repealed, taken away off the books about a year after that. Okay. Um, Meanwhile, Jacob is writing more and more stories, and Jacob, for the most part, becomes the victim of his own success. Jacob's stories about Joaquin being this Robin Hood character start to take on a life of their own, and now what's happening is people are really, really conflating that Joaquin is this goon, this monster. He's a villain. He's like the Napoleon of banditry. Uh, that is Jacob does such a fantastic job of making Joaquin turn out to be this larger than life figure that what it did was for a lot of Anglo American miners in the area, they were fearful of any Mexican they came across. They feared that, oh, he's part of Joaquin's gang, or he's with Joaquin too. I saw riding with Joaquin earlier. A lot of stories were coming out stating that people saw Joaquin. He was in Sacramento. He was down towards down toward he was down towards San Francisco. He was down in San Jose. He was down toward Los Angeles. All kinds of these accounts were stating that Joaquin was all over the place, which of course wasn't true. But the legend took on a life of its own. There were legends that there were actually five Joaquins, not just Joaquin Murrieta, but Joaquin Valenzuela, Joaquin Ocomarena, Joaquin Carrillo. They might have been a Joaquin Cañado for all I know, but you get the idea, everybody. This was stuff that Jacob thought he could, you might say, make a living writing about this great, wild, larger than life figure, but the legend took on a life of its own, and it really caused a lot of problems for the Mexican populations in California, not just the lower class, that is, the miners who came in from Sonora early on for the gold rush, you might say the lower class Mexicans, but the upper class Mexicans, the Californios, the ones who had been there for a long, long time, like the De La Gueras in Santa Barbara, the Carrillos of Los Angeles, and the Vallejo family of Northern California. Longtime Californians who'd been there for many, many years, for seemingly generations, they were seen too as the enemy, as the friends of Joaquin, that type of thing. Uh, even though I'm adding a little bit more to what's happening in the story, this was going on at the same time, and of course, Rawls and Bean get into this in quite a bit more detail. Okay. Meantime, as for Eliza, she doesn't know about Joaquin. Is she still in love with him? Is he still alive? Where is he? Did he go back to Chile? Did he go to Mexico? Wherever. So Eliza's starting to question her love for him, and she has to keep reminding herself why she came in the first place. But slowly but surely, all the memories of Joaquin are fading away for Eliza, and she's realizing that she's making a life for herself independently of what brought her to California in the first place. Meanwhile, Dow, for his part, he recognizes that despite all the problems, all the chaos, all the confusion, all the drama, all the tragedy, all the this, all the that, he realizes the best key to achieving success is to stay in position, but to achieve American citizenship. So that would then be his goal, but as chapter 20 begins to wrap up. All right, finally, chapter 21, and this is a pretty lengthy one, so I'll go over as many things as possible over these next five or so minutes. Uh, Chapter 21, an unusual pair chapter. Dao's success as a healer really starts to accelerate, and he moves into Union Square in San Francisco. So Dao already is becoming, you might say, one of the elites, one of the upper classes among the Chinese community in San Francisco. And and of course, that means he still has to come in contact with Toy, has to treat her, but he still treats her professionally. But at the same time, he's still maintaining his operation. That is, in terms of rescuing the Sing Song girls and having people like James, Babalu, Joe, and the rest of the people that from the Gold Country area, from the Sacramento area, to help out and send those girls to freedom, to the east. Bit of an irony here. And one thing about the Sing Song Girls episode, I've never come across too many books or anything which have really touched upon this. So uh, one of the things I'd like to do is eventually talk to some of the scholars in the state who specialize in Asian studies and ask them what they know about this idea of a underground railroad in reverse, because ironically, in that back in these days, the idea was, well, go west for freedom, go west for opportunity, for adventure. For these sing-song girls, it was go east. Get the hell away from California. Get away from Atoy and all the people, all these you might say early versions of Johns, if you will, taking advantage of the girls in these types of operations. So interesting side note about that. And when I first read the book, I'd never known about something like this before. So it's definitely something I'd like to check on if these types of stories did indeed exist back in the 1850s. Okay. Okay. Let me shift the story a little bit back down to Chile uh, because of course back in Chile we're wondering about how Rose is doing, and of course Rose is devastated by the disappearance of Eliza. Um, Rose has been going through, you might say, the change of life. In fact, this German doctor says that Rose is going through the quote the change, but when Rose gets news back from John by way of Jacob that they saw Eliza, that even that Eliza was dressed as a young boy, that definitely perked up Rose. So Rose, toward the middle part of the chapter, begins to regain her old self. So for those of you who are fans of Rose, undoubtedly, I think you were quite pleased by this. In that Aina didn't forget Rose. Rose definitely. The fact that she knew or she had the idea that Eliza was still alive, that definitely perked her up. And I think anyone who was a fan of Rose probably got perked up and excited as well. Okay. Now, May of 1853 would prove to be a pivotal point in the state because what's happening here in the state is the fact that all these stories of Joaquin Murrieta and his band of goons and misfits and thugs, whatever you want to call them, including Three Finger Jack, who was notoriously evil toward Chinese. Um, Something had to be done. The governor was, or it was Governor Bigler, that I think at the time was there was a lot of pressure for him to really clamp down on Joaquin, try to track this guy down. So ironically, it seemed that the story of Joaquin, the legend, really started to consolidate California as a state in terms of the use of violence. That is use of police powers to bring in a wanted man, bring in a criminal. So in other words, it really took the story of Joaquin to really marshal state forces and make the state a viable entity. That is, as the body which has a monopoly of violence, that is violence against criminals, bandits, goons, thugs, or if you remember the classic scene from Blazing Saddles, where Harvey Korman, who's Hedley Lamar, was saying to the foreman, Mr. Taggart, that he wanted pugs, mugs, thugs, bandits, scalawags, hoodlums. So if you remember that scene from Blazing Saddles, for the most part, I think that was the mentality that was going on in California at this point in time. That is, in order to round up all these goons and thugs and bad people or evildoers, whatever term you wish to use, you had to track down Joaquin. So Sheriff Harry Love was brought on the scene to try to rein in Joaquin and put an end to this cycle of madness or violence, which was scaring a lot of people. In that there was a marauding band of Mexicans causing mayhem and mischief in the person of Joaquin Murrieta and his band of merry men, so to speak. Okay. Um, so while this is going on, of course, the relationship between Dow and Eliza becomes much more stronger. So there's definitely a stronger bond of friendship. It's not romance, but at least not at that point. Um, but interestingly, uh, I believe that the event which you might say really um, I guess consolidates or solidifies the love they have for each other is at the very end of the story when the courtesan Lola Mondes comes to visit San Francisco, and she was an actual person. Do Google a Wikipedia search for her, and you'll find she had a really fascinating story. So what this tells us is that people in California and San Francisco uh, they wanted to hear all these stories about love and romance and wild and reckless, or romps in the bedroom, tales of ribaldry, whatever term you wish to use. And for Lola to get that type of reception in San Francisco, must have been something at the time in terms of people's expectations, and really no wonder too, because keep in mind, everybody, a lot of the people going to to California early on was mostly men. Uh, you had this wide imbalance of men who dominated the state early on. It wasn't until about 1853, 54 when more and more women came on the scene. So the fact that Lola really caused a commotion, caused a lot of excitement, if you will, um, it's really no big surprise because when you have all these men who hadn't really had much female contact for the better part of 2, 3, 4, maybe 5 years, it's no surprise that you might say she got a hero's welcome. But I think the point that Allende was trying to make was that the was that the notion of ideas of such as love, romance, desire, passion, whatever term you wish to use. Um, I think that idea, the fact that since Lola um, brought about all these emotions, these senses. I think I think that lesson wasn't lost on people like Eliza and Dow. Uh, they knew what they had in each other. They could count on each other. They knew each other's feelings. So when it came to that final climactic scene at the end, when allegedly Joaquin was caught and his head was placed in a jar of a whiskey or bourbon, I forget exactly what the substance it was that his head was in, and they went to San Francisco. They went to see exactly if that was the Joaquin that Eliza had been following, if that really was her old lover Joaquin. And Dow asked, "Well, was it?" She didn't say, but all she said was, I am free." So you draw your own conclusions as to what happens there. Was that Joaquin or was it not? We don't know, and it looks like we'll never really know. But I think the fact of the matter was that because Eliza said that I am free, that she was free from a lot of things. She was free from the social strictures of being back in uh, of of the summer's life back in Chile in Valparaiso, and the fact and I think by this one time she was free from being a boy because she had posed as a young man for quite a while now. So now she had you might say reemerged as a woman. And I think the other thing was that she was finally free of this romance of Joaquin. So even if that was him or not in his head in the jar of whiskey, that wasn't the point. The point was she was finally free of that ghost, and she could now begin her life, and she could, and of course she began her life with Dao. And if you recall from earlier parts of the story, Allende at many points in time flashes forward to events in the future. So there are a few points in the story where you got some hints that Eliza and Dow had essentially been a married couple going into maybe the latter parts of the 1850s, whereas the story actually ends in 1853. So it was a great book. I hope all of you liked it, and stuff like that I'll keep using for not just this class, but for the History 108 class as well. Now, as for the Rolls and Beans stuff, I'm not going to go over a lot of a lot of points in terms of what happened in chapters 13 and 14. But I think what's good about those chapters is that those chapters start with the railroad. So basically, when the story of Daughter of Fortune ends in 1853, Rawls and Bean pick up the story in chapters 13 and 14 because they're talking about the building of the transcontinental road. And of course, the legendary Big Four figures. Of course, we're talking about people like Hopkins, Huntington, Stanford, Crocker, and of course Theodore Judah too, as part of the honor member of the Big Four. So the 1850s, there was this. The rest of the decade, there was a sense that a lot of momentum was coming in to try to link California to the rest of the country, and of course the railroads was a key component. And despite the Civil War starting in 1861, that didn't stop the momentum that was building within the state because keep in mind, even though the war was raging, uh, in the rest of the U.S. in the 1860s, President Lincoln was still running the country and still signing laws, signing legislation to advance the interests of the country with things such as the Homestead Act and of course the Pacific Railroad Act, which is mentioned quite a bit in the Rawls and Bean text. And interestingly, I guess of course what helped the Lincoln was the fact that with all the with all the southern senators and congressmen out of the picture. Of course, he had a Congress much more agreeable to him because he didn't have these southern yahoos causing a mischief. I declare, Mr. President, sir, this thing is unconstitutional, blah blah blah, that type of thing. But you get the idea. Lincoln was still able to do things for the nation. That is, he was able to run the country, but also prosecute a war with, of course, people like Ulysses S. Grant, William T. Sherman, Philip Sheridan, and many others. But again, I think my point is, again, without getting into all the details about chapter 13 and 14, those two chapters really give a sense of how the state really progressed, that is, in terms of communications, with, of course, the railroads and also telegraph too, and of course the shipping, which and I think we got a sense of the growth of shipping with a daughter of fortune story. Of course, there was a lot of politics going on, a lot of corruption, a lot of dirty deeds, backroom deals, that type of thing. California, the railroad took on the nickname of the octopus, as the author Frank Norris charted in his book from the beginning, from the turn of the century. Uh, but nonetheless, uh, the state grew dramatically in the 1850s and into the 1860s, and of course into the 1870s. And I think when the Daughter of Fortune story ends, and you're wondering what's going to happen with Dow and Eliza in 1853, it seems a sense of foreshadowing that they seem to know that big things are going to happen for the state in terms of politics, society, culture, economics, and of course, Paulina early on, she knew California would become a beacon for economic progress and prosperity. So um, I think when you finish Daughter of Fortune, again, that's the final point I'll say here, you get the sense that there was a sense of optimism that the world was endless. There was endless opportunities for Dow and Liza as the story ended. And you wonder too about the other people like Jacob Freeman. Would he find peace of mind and would he be happy writing things? And how Paulina would fare as a businesswoman. You wonder what's going to happen with her in the 1850s and the rest and into the 1860s. But the fact that California does grow dramatically for the next 2 decades after that, I think you can safely say that, yeah, I think the characters of Daughter Fortune in the latter parts of the 19th century, I think they did quite well as the state grew dramatically uh, after the 1850s. Then, not surprisingly, the Daughter Fortune characters they grew as well. And you can pick up on the story in a lot more detail, of course, with the sequel Portrait in Sepia. Haven't read that yet, but I'll definitely check it out over the summer and find out what happens to the offspring. That is the second, the generation after Dow, Eliza, Rose, John, Jacob, Paulina, Babalu, Joe, and the rest of our friends from the story. Okay, so that's everyone. That's it for the videos for quite a while. But after the spring break, I'll definitely have a couple more as we get more toward the final stages of the semester. All right, it's been a pleasure doing all these videos for you, but I still have a couple more to go before the semester wraps up. And I'll talk to you guys again after the spring break.